Good morning. I am Saini at the University of Canberra. I'm speaking with Michelle Grattan in our weekly conversation about politics in Australia. Good morning, Michelle.
Hi, Deep.
Michelle, we start with the sad news today. The former Deputy Prime Minister Tim Fischer has passed away after a long battle with cancer. He was a person who was so well liked by Australians, very special character. What kind of legacy has he left?
He leaves a strong personal and political legacy. He was much loved by the Australian community. He was a character, a political character in an era when you tend to get white-bread politicians. But in terms of substance, he was an effective leader of his party, but also a strong partner to John Howard, who was facing difficult issues, especially the effort to introduce gun control. Now, this was unpopular in the bush, and Tim Fischer, despite that, stood firm, was absolutely resolute, went out and sold the cause. And of course, Australia has gun laws that are admired by so many countries overseas.
So principles over popularity.
Yes, but he was popular too. But certainly he stuck to principles. Now, it wasn't all easy. Often when we look back on these periods, we think only of the successes, but Tim Fischer faced some criticism, not just in terms of the base with gun control, but within his own party too. Times there were leadership rumblings. The Queenslanders were particularly difficult. So he had a very challenging time to manage the situation internally and externally.
Speaking of guns, the heat is rising in the Strait of Hormuz, where Americans and Iranians are having a standoff. And Prime Minister has just recently announced that Australian forces would be joining US forces there. How big is this commitment from Australia, and what are the risks and rewards in this?
It's a limited commitment. We're sending a ship from the beginning of next year. There's a plane being deployed for a limited time this year, and we're contributing some personnel to the headquarters of the operation. I think there was never any doubt that Australia would join this operation to protect the sea lanes. The alliance is so strong with the United States, and of course during the AUSMIN talks recently, the Americans made it very clear publicly that they wanted us to be part of this operation. Now, Scott Morrison would prefer that more countries were involved. At the moment, it's only the United States, the United Kingdom and Australia. It's hoped to recruit some more, but I think that it's an operation that the Australians feel is worth any risk. We haven't really heard in any detail yet the rules of engagement, but the Prime Minister stresses that we have been involved in operations against piracy and the like, so that in a way this is not something that's new to us, but nevertheless there are always dangers.
And symbolically it's important, I guess.
Yes, it is, and the government does make a distinction between an operation to keep the sea lanes open and the other Iranian-United States conflict.
Scott Morrison has just reached 12 months in office as Prime Minister, first when he came to power after dramatic events of last year, and then he led the coalition to a victory. Give us a summary of his record, and how would you characterize that record?
Obviously, the most dramatic part of the last year was Scott Morrison winning that amazing election victory, and that was predicted by very, very few people. So that's been the big thing, but now we're seeing Scott Morrison turning into the Prime Minister who governs, not just the Prime Minister who primarily campaigns, although I think he always keeps in mind his role as campaigner, as marketer of a message. He has come through as quite incremental in his approach. Don't frighten the horses, appeal to the quiet Australians. It's become his catchphrase. He's saying these people are alienated from politics because the so-called Canberra bubble, as he puts it, doesn't take enough account of their interests. So he looks locally, he looks to issues like improving the delivery of services, and we have yet to see the extent to which he really is going to do big things, because at the moment it seems a series of smaller things. Not that they're not important, but they're pitched at things that people care about in the immediate. Of course, the last few months have seen him concerned with foreign affairs to a considerable extent. This weekend he goes to the G7 in France, where Australia is an observer for the first time. He's had a rather difficult time in the Pacific, although the Pacific is a big priority for him, but of course the meeting at Tuvalu was not a particularly happy occasion. But one of the main issues that Scott Morrison is dealing with currently and will continue to have to grapple with is Australia's policy on China. And this is a complicated thing. It's far bigger than just the trade issue. It's also Chinese incursions into Australian sovereignty, and the complexities of that, I think, will, for Scott Morrison, be a big thing in the coming months and years.
Speaking of Chinese incursions, I want to have your thoughts on China and the higher education sector in this country. You're aware that tensions are continuing in Hong Kong, and those tensions are spilling over into our campuses. There have been some rather nasty incidents on the campuses. And that has reignited the debate in the society about Chinese influence on our campuses. How real is it in your view, the Chinese influence that is, and how justified are the concerns that are being expressed?
I think the influence is real, and of course it's not just on campuses with students, but there's been instances of hacking into university databases, and in the community more generally, I think that there has been rising concern about Chinese influence, Chinese government influence. And of course one area which affects the universities is research, and there's the whole question of the extent to which research is shared. And more widely than that, you've got issues around foreign investment. Now, in terms of the students, I think it is important that universities don't become too dependent on foreign students generally. Foreign students are really important at a number of levels, and particularly education now is a huge Australian export, but nevertheless we have to be careful that the dependence doesn't become so great that if that supply of students was cut back, that would be some sort of disaster for the universities. In terms of freedom of opinion, it's important for the universities to always reinforce that their campuses are places where opinions contest, but that they contest in a peaceful and respectful way, that Australian democratic values are very much on display at universities, and that should be really clear and projected by the university sector.
Yeah, this is surely a complex situation, and it has wider implications in the broader political spheres. So we'll have to watch it carefully and see which way it goes.
It's very complex for the university administrators and for the community more generally.
Thank you, Michelle. You have a nice weekend, and we'll talk again next Friday.
Thanks, Steve.